I'm Dr. Vanessa Sinclair, and this is Rendering Unconscious. My guest today is Dr. Robert BESHARA, a critical psychologist interested in theorizing subjectivity vis-a-vis ideology through radical qualitative research, discourse analysis. In addition to being a scholar and activist, he is a fine artist with a background in film, theater, and music, holding 2 terminal degrees, a PhD in psychology, consciousness, and society from the University of West Georgia, and an MFA in independent film and digital imaging from Governor State University, Illinois. He currently works as an assistant professor of psychology at Northern New Mexico College. For more information, visit his website www.robertbeshara.com. That's ROBERTBESHARA.com. Rendering Unconscious is also a book. Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry. Available from Trapart Books, 2019. Please visit our publisher's website, www.trapart.net. You can support the podcast by visiting our Patreon, patreon.com/VANESSA23CARL. Your support is greatly appreciated. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode. Your book is amazing.
Thank you very much.
I want everybody to start wherever they want, so start wherever you want, but your book is amazing.
Well, thank you so much. So thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me on this amazing podcast. And I was listening yesterday to the podcast with Alfonso, so I really enjoyed that. And of course, I listened to other ones as well. So it's great to be part of this.
Yeah, he's great.
Yeah. It was nice to hear his voice, too, because, we've been friends online, but this was the first time to actually hear him. So, but yeah, that book is a long story, really, for it to come together. And I was thinking about that, all the different pieces that eventually led to that book manifesting itself. So kind of a long story. And if I were to trace it back to a certain moment, it has to do with kind of the politicization of my own subjectivity right after 9/11. And as you may know, I'm originally from Egypt. I was born and grew up in Cairo. And so, around the time when, the tragic events of 9/11 took place, I was an undergraduate student at the American University in Cairo. And so, of course, all of us around the world got affected by that event. And there was an assumption from the US, of course, that maybe people in my part of the world didn't care or supported that. And so everyone was pretty much shocked. And so even though I experienced it from Egypt, it was probably as shocking as experiencing it in the US because of how it was mediated and how immediate it was with the coverage and everything. So the thing that really affected me right after that, of course, was the war on terror that was launched right after in reaction to 9/11. So it had I knew that 9/11 was wrong, but I also knew that the war on terror was wrong. So I had this sort of political, ethical response to that, and it's been, consuming me ever since. So that's kind of the long story, and this was happening. So I got really, I saw how unjust that war was, and it made me, it really politicized my subjectivity. And then, of course, jump forward, there was the Egyptian Revolution in 2011, which was a kind of a big deal for me as well, because, I grew up under the dictatorship of, Hosni Mubarak. So that's the only president that I knew all my life. And all of a sudden, this idea that the people could actually come together and put pressure on this government and force them to resign was quite a powerful idea in practice, of course. So, so the war on terror was kind of like always there, and then it took a while for me to articulate that theoretically and kind of do the kind of discourse analysis that I do with that, because I was very much interested in the rhetoric and the effect of that and the propaganda aspect of it, given the repetition of that discourse in the media. And of course, it's still relevant because it's an endless war, and it gets indexed by all kinds of leaders around the world, right? So it's pretty much a very relevant framework to this day, right?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yes.
and you're right. You point out in the book that that Bush immediately said, you're either with us or against us. And I grew up in Florida, and even then, I was in grad school at the time. I guess I started grad school in 2002, and I remember my sister's a photojournalist, and so she was over in Iraq working, and she was telling me all of these things that were going on there that we weren't seeing in the news and that sort of thing. And I remember being at like a friend's barbecue and like talking to other people that I thought were like pretty progressive and were my age and were like trying to pay more attention and not just buy into this kind of rhetoric. And I was telling them like the things that she was telling me, and I was actually asked to leave. Like my friends asked me to leave because everyone had gotten like so, patriotic, at that moment. Right. So I was pretty shocked.
Yeah, so that's what I call pseudopatriotism, because it's very simplistic. We're being positioned by that discourse to take, like you said, one of two positions, two subject positions, right? So either we completely agree with the war on terror, or if we don't, then we're automatically the enemy, right? So obviously the world is way more complex than that. So how do we account for that complexity? And that's what I've been trying to wrestle with, to kind of break down that discourse and show that even within the logic of that discourse, there are at least four subject positions and two that are implicit in there. And so that's what I tried to do with the semiotic square from Greimas. And that really is helpful because it gives us a sense of imagining a negative space in that discourse that's afforded by this dominant discourse, which also affords us a place from which to resist this discourse. And that's using the logic of this discourse, not thinking from outside of it. So that was kind of interesting to kind of just the move from 2 to 4. It symbolizes a move towards complexity, from binarism to kind of 4 subject positions to say that, well, we're talking about complexity. So obviously you can jump from 4 to infinity, and that was the idea, is to kind of open it up. So that's kind of the beginning of that work. And then Islamophobia, which is the other piece of this, because the Islamophobia piece, I experienced it on a personal level, and I talk about that in the book. And it was a moment very similar to the moment that Frantz Fanon had on a train when, a child was pointing at him saying, "Look, a Negro," right? And so I had a similar moment when I did an MFA in independent film and digital imaging before doing my PhD in psychology. And, so I was acting in this film, and actually in that short film, I was reading quotes in French by Godard and different people. And so it's, really cool, short, artsy kind of film. And then the reaction from one of my fellow students in the class is like, wow, you look like a terrorist. So I'm like, why? There's no context for this. Like, the film is super artsy. I'm speaking in French. What made you say that, right? And what made you perceive me this way? And of course, I was shocked, but then I took some time to think about it, to consider that this person, like many other people, are just positioned in a certain way to see me in a certain way, right? And that's one of the effects of that discourse, is that really it affects how we think and how we see the world. And this is kind of the dangerous part of it. Mm-hmm. And so it made me realize that I'm perceived this way. That's the first time I kind of had that experience. And so it got me really interested, particularly because, I'm not actually Muslim. It made me even more interested. And of course, the assumption in that statement is, of course, that because I'm from quote unquote the Middle East and I look a certain way, that I look like a terrorist, and that is somehow associated with Islam. So there's all these unconscious associations in that loaded statement. So it got me interested. It took me a long time to get to the point, and this is where psychoanalysis was really helpful. Because with the discourse analysis, I was able to analyze the discourse itself, but I wasn't able to, just with that, link it with how, what's the connection between Islamophobia, in other words, and war on terror discourse? That was the big question for me that I try to answer in the book. And I haven't seen that theorized anywhere. So everyone assumes that there's a connection, but there's not theorized, mm-hmm. right? And so the theorization, basically, that the fantasy of Islamophobia, which is unconscious, actually sustains the discourse. So it's always implicit. And I've done a lot of experiments because I teach. When I ask my students, when you think of the word terrorist, what do you think of? And they're afraid to tell me, but the first thing they think of is Muslim. So there's that unconscious association, right? Where does it come from? Well, it comes from the propaganda, from the repetition of signifiers, right? And then chaining those signifiers in a certain way. And that's another way of explaining how propaganda works, right?
Yeah, and the phenomenon in the U.S. where every time there's a shooting, they will never call the person a terrorist if he's like a white, cis, Christian man,
Absolutely. So it's a very politicized term, and that's why I had to do in the second chapter, like an archaeology of counterterrorism. And I kind of use that term it's hard to kind of talk about it, but counters in parentheses, to kind of say that, are they really different, or is counterterrorism a form of terrorism, mm-hmm. right? And that's the question of state terrorism, which is a question, of course, another type of terrorism that's completely never considered. So the question of terrorism, if we think about it, it's political violence, usually, against civilians. This is why we find it appalling, right? So it's not a war situation where it's armies fighting each other, right? So it's and so that's the definition. Now, who's doing it? It doesn't just have to be non-state actors. It could also be the state doing this. Mm-hmm. And so that's how you expand that term to kind of question counterterrorism and the war on terror as furthering the terrorism as opposed to ending it. So that's the other piece of the puzzle for me, is analyzing how the discourse works, and also sort of evaluating the effectiveness of the strategy, and actually how it perpetuates the problem. And of course, this is not an accident, because it's very profitable, right, for the military-industrial complex and for politicians to capitalize on all the affects associated with the discourse, right? And that's how you render that's how you render citizens docile subjects, right? You just have them always be afraid, and they're more easily controlled. But if we actually think rationally and think about justice and think through this, I'm really interested in reducing, and I know you edit a book on violence, so I know you're interested in this question too. I'm really interested in the question of violence, and really interested in reducing violence in the world and reducing oppression. And I can easily show that the war on terror as a discourse and as an actual strategy doesn't work, and actually exacerbates the problem, right?
Do you want to talk a little bit about the Lacanian discourse analysis? Because probably a lot of people aren't familiar with that.
Yeah, so this is a development from within critical psychology, and there are different people that contributed to this development. So it's a qualitative research method, because there are different forms of discourse analysis, and I've used different ones out there. And this specific one is a type of research, qualitative research method, and it's mostly associated with Ian Parker, who's a British critical psychologist and a mentor and a colleague and a friend. And he pretty much is one of the, I would say, the leading figures in giving us the guidelines and the steps for doing that type of analysis. So it draws heavily on Jacques Lacan's Seminar 17, but not only that, but just Lacan's theorization of language and discourse in general. But there's a big focus on the four discourses and how there are different positions within those discourses and how those discourses change and how they relate to one another. So it's very interesting because from the beginning I was interested in rhetoric and language and discourse, and I've experimented with different approaches from Foucault to Fairclough, and like I said, the missing piece for me was that psychoanalysis allows is the fantasy piece, and that's related to the unconscious. Again, most other discourse analysts are not going to explore that territory. And what's interesting about the Lacanian sort of conceptualization of the unconscious is that it's hidden in plain sight. So it's not necessarily something that's hidden deep beneath the text. It's something that you can see in the text itself. So that makes it really empirical and interesting, right? So when I conducted 19 interviews with U.S. Muslims because I was interested to learn about their accounts of Islamophobia and how they resist it. And I wanted to see the effects of the war on terror discourse and the Islamophobia fantasy on the way they're speaking and what's that doing to their subjectivity. And so Lacanian discourse analysis allowed me to do that and to show that they're actually resisting the discourse and the fantasy in two different ways, through knowledge, and so they're contesting the dominant knowledge, or through their own being, ontologically, by actually putting their body on the line, by being in spaces where they know that they could be in danger for just how they look like, right? And so that was interesting, and of course it challenges the two kind of dominant discourses of the master and the university, and to some extent the capitalist, of course, because I talk a little bit about that in the beginning, and how they do that through the hysteric discourse, which is really, if we're interested in knowledge, this is the kind of discourse that we should be drawn to, not the university discourse, because the university ultimately works for the master, right? Mm-hmm. And the analyst discourse is questioning the master, hopefully to create new master signifiers. So basically to get us out of this whole ideology that we're stuck in and we haven't been able to think outside of. And so Lacanian discourse analysis really gave me the tools to be able to do that kind of work. I don't think I would have been able to do it using a different method.
Yeah, it was my first time encountering it. And it's all I kept thinking was like, this study's amazing, and like how many different ways this could be applied, Yeah,
it's not a very popular method. So I think my attempt was, because there are maybe like 2 books on this and a number of articles. So it didn't really take off, but I was really drawn to it, as you can tell, and I wanted to show here's an application of it. So one more contribution, one more book, illustrating how it could work, and also in a way expanding it with the decolonial perspective.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah, so actually the way I came up with that, this is kind of an interesting story. So there's a conference that I like to go to. It's called the Islamophobia Studies Conference, and it's at UC Berkeley. And the person that organizes that conference, he's Hatem Bazian. He's Palestinian, and he was on my dissertation committee. Okay, so and I got to know him through the conference. So I presented there maybe like 4 times, and maybe during my second time presenting there, I had this controversial backlash to the presentation, which was thought-provoking for me. So I was theorizing Islamophobia as a fundamental fantasy using Zizek's analysis in The Plague of Fantasies in terms of anti-Semitism under, National Socialism. And so seeing how that relates to Islamophobia. And I think it's a very interesting analysis. But the person an audience member that during the Q&A felt really angry that I was citing Zizek. And this, to give you the context, this was around the refugee crisis and the articles that he wrote in these times that were very controversial. And they no longer allowed him to write there after that. And so basically, she wasn't looking at the analysis and more kind of turned off by the signifier Zizek. Why is that an important signifier for the work that we're doing in resisting Islamophobia, right? And so and of course it was a very emotional response. So I listened, and I didn't have something to say right away, but I wanted to think more about it, why she's reacting this way. So my reaction came in the form of a paper that I presented in Manchester in 2017, which is called Decolonizing Psychoanalysis, Psychoanalyzing Islamophobia. And in this paper, what I tried to do is not defend Zizek, actually say that he's not an Islamophobe, because that was her argument. I don't think he is, but I think that he's sloppy when it comes to his theorization of Islamophobia. In other words, there's an under-theorization of Islamophobia in his work, and we can even say maybe in the Lacanian field in general. And so I took it upon myself to say that we shouldn't throw away Zizek's work because of some stupid comments he made, or because he's being sloppy, because there's a lot there that we can use, especially in the older Zizek, in my opinion. And that's what I tried to do. So kind of using Zizek against Zizek, if you will, right? And that
Which you would appreciate.
Yeah. And so that was the idea, is to respond to that person in my mind with that paper, and that really was a big development in my work that led to the book eventually. And so the idea was, if you look at critical psychology, particularly as developed by Ian Parker, he draws on 4 theoretical resources. He draws on Marxism, feminism, post-structuralism, and psychoanalysis. And so he's a Lacanian psychoanalyst practicing in Manchester. But one thing that I thought was missing from that was the post-colonial, decolonial perspective, which obviously is meaningful to me as someone from Egypt, from North Africa. So something that I'm sensitive to, that I care about, which is how is psychoanalysis relevant in my part of the world? How can we think about it differently from the global South, right? So that's the question. And the decolonial perspective is and we can get into that decolonial, post-colonial aspect, but the decolonial perspective was a way of putting psychoanalysis in check. So I'm using psychoanalysis to analyze Islamophobia and the war on terror, but at the same time, psychoanalysis needs to be put in check, because it's not a meta language, right? And so the way I do that is I do it through a decolonial perspective. Now, of course, this could be infinite regress, and how do you keep the decolonial perspective in check? And I don't have a solution to that problem, but the idea is to have an outside perspective in dialogue with that, to make sure that we're being sensitive and we're not being hegemonic in our interpretation. And so that was kind of my it took me a while to think about the answer. It had to be in the form of a paper because, and I don't know if she will be satisfied if she reads that, but that was kind of my answer to her question, but it took me a while to do it.
Yeah, but it's great when that kind of thing happens. Like, I've given talks before and then had not so pleasant reactions in the moment, but then it really gets me thinking about what I'm
Yeah,
talking about in a different way and makes you like think about it more and articulate
I love it.
yourself
Yeah,
better, you know?
exactly. Exactly. I love the challenge because it makes you, exactly like you said, think harder about it, how to articulate it, and makes you think about why you're doing the things you're doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that was important to be challenged that way. It was a good challenge because ultimately led me to write those things.
I would love to be able to, I do conferences and things, and I would love to try to put something together that has, more perspectives, or if we could have a conference like in North Africa, or, include
Yeah.
include more people.
Yeah. And you're familiar probably with Mustafa Safwan, right? So he's Egyptian and he studied directly with Lacan. Now, of course, I think many in the Lacanian field know about him, but I don't see him being cited as much.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But for someone from Egypt to see his name being referenced is meaningful to me, right? And that there's that link. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, there's psychoanalysis in Egypt, and there's a whole. I think this is the big question for me is because obviously we don't want psychoanalysis to work in the sense of a civilizing mission, right? Here it is. It's been developed in Europe. Let's take it to outside of Europe so that we can civilize these people and they can catch up, right? So there's sometimes this assumption, I think, from some psychoanalysts, and that's where like the ideology, I think of secularism and sometimes Christianity and is working implicitly, unconsciously, that it's somehow, in terms of value, it's better, and that somehow it's completely in harmony with psychoanalysis, even though Freud himself was a Jewish atheist. And there's an interesting paper, I think, by Alberto Toscano about the methodological atheism of Freud and how that's different from the ideology of secularism. And that ideology pretends to be non-religious or irreligious, but literally is just making Christianity acceptable as the dominant framework, right? And so the conference actually that I presented at in Manchester tried to address this question, which is, I don't know if you heard about this conference. It was called Psychoanalytic Islamic Psychoanalysis, and it was co-organized by Ian Parker with Sabah Siddiqui, and it's really, really cool conference. And then they published a book of conference proceedings. So I have that paper that I was telling you about in there. But that conference was trying to address this question, ultimately to think about, well, if you're let's say a non-Muslim psychoanalyst and you have a Muslim analysand, are we going to pretend that there's nothing to think about that relationship here, that religion has some kind of effect, not necessarily in terms as a religion, but culturally, in terms of language and all of that. So this is an interesting question to think about, and we can't pretend that it's not a relevant question. And so we have to think about psychoanalysis, like you said, from different perspectives, and we need to challenge it, and ultimately that makes it more interesting, I think.
Yeah, and I think what you do beautifully in the book is like, there's a big problem with psychoanalysis having been used to like normalize, like you're saying, or civilize people,
Yeah.
normalize people, help them go to work and have their families and whatever, especially in the United States. With like ego psychology and everything. But what you do and what you talk about doing, and what I think Lacanian psychoanalysis does better, is like help open up questions, open up possibilities and different ways of being or different subjective positions, rather than like closing things down into like knowledge, which would be like you said, the university kind of more master oriented discourse.
Absolutely. And the point that I'm trying to make, which is a difficult point to make in this world, unfortunately, but it's not that complicated of a point, is, There are 1.7 billion Muslims in the world. Just think about the complexity in terms of the differences in terms of subjectivity, right? In terms of the languages, nations, cultures. Yet we think of that group as a monolithic group. And I think psychoanalysis sometimes, and this is where I find it problematic, deals with that group as one thing. Whereas I think the correct approach is to deal with every single subject, the singularity of the subject. So yeah, sure, there's this contingency of you being Muslim and from that part of the world, but then let's talk about subjectivity, which is what I try to show is that I interviewed all these US Muslims, but they're all different. And you can find some connections with the discourses, but the discourse is not something that's fixed and doesn't change. The subject positions are constantly moving around, right, and flow. Yeah.
Exactly. And the opposite way of thinking about something similar is like, because I've just moved out of the U.S. last year.
Yeah.
So thinking like, I wish I could show Americans like, America's like 4.5% of the world population. Like it's not a lot.
Exactly.
There's like billions and billions and billions of people out there. Everybody's
Right.
very different from the way America thinks everybody is or should be.
Absolutely. And then Muslims in the US are like 1% of the population, but they're hyper visible in the media, which puts them in a very difficult position, right? And so, that's the issue, right? And it really boils down to when you see someone, and that's the question of racialization. Like if you perceive a person that's different from you, how we automatically racialize the person as this or that, right? And of course that leads to stereotyping and all kinds of things, and ultimately racism, right? And so why are we not able to perceive that subject as different and interesting and as contributing to complexity of the world? That's the kind of what I try to do with my work, is to show that. But even seeing some reactions online to people who haven't even read the book, just reacting to the title and being turned off completely and being angry and hateful, and like they're not even willing to read and to learn, which is, again, it confirms my point that we need more work to do. Right?
There's a lot more work to do.
Yeah. So this is just the beginning.
What kind of reactions have you gotten overall?
Overall, I've received very positive reactions, but I came across a post on Instagram that I didn't know about. I think a friend in Brazil sent it to me, and all the comments were, I think, mostly from Europeans and some Americans. Very negative comments, like using vomiting emojis and things like that. Like, you haven't even, just because it has, and if I had to like analyze what it is, it's just because of the subtitle, the Islamophobia. A lot of people, when they see that word, they think, and this is actually part of my criticism of Zizek, because this is where he's wrong. Like, this is the right-wing reaction to that term, which is they think that this term means curtailing freedom of speech or criticism of that. That's the right-wing interpretation. So when they see Islamophobia, they're like, you're just basically not allowing us to talk about Islam, right? And Zizek, by the way, writes about it this way. This is why I think he's wrong here, and why he needs to do more effort. And I hope like he does eventually to come around about this point. But ultimately, why I care about this, and this term actually, I get into this term, and it's not a perfect term, obviously, because it's very actually psychologized term. It has the phobia part of it. But then what term in the world is perfect? It's nothing to do with the signified. It has to do how the signifier works, and that's what interests me. So for me, the signifier is relevant for Muslims because it speaks to their experience with something which is oppressive to them. And so, yeah, we can debate whether this is a good term or not, but ultimately it has a practical value for people interested in this struggle and in reducing that kind of oppression in the world. So you can call it anti-Muslim racism, you can call it whatever you want, but that happens to be the most popular term, so it's strategic for me to use it, you know. But I think it's there's the reaction to the Islam part of it, which is this all the negative association with that signifier, and that kind of automatic reaction. And again, I'm writing as a non-Muslim, right? And when I go present at conferences with comrades, you know, because I'm an ally in this struggle, they get that and they respect that, and that's what's beautiful about that world. Is it's not about identity politics per se. It's about a collective struggle against a form of oppression that we're opposed to, right? It has nothing to do whether I'm Muslim or not, and what kind of Muslim I am, or how religious I am, and all of those things. So that's, you know, that's the difference between actually thinking through something and automatically reacting. And a lot of these people who are automatically reacting tend to be liberals who think of themselves as progressives, but ultimately, in those instances, they're very reactionary, right? Literally, in response.
Yeah, well, that means that it was the right word to choose. you
Yeah.
know, clearly it's a really loaded signifier.
Yeah, it's a loaded signifier, exactly.
Which means that, yeah, you have to use it. And I think that was another really beautiful point in your book, was like the pluralism, and like, you know, how you have to, like, all the different kinds of struggles need to work together against this like master discourse.
Yeah, absolutely. Because obviously, and that's something that's beautiful in terms of like the intersectionality of struggles. And this is a concept from Angela Davis, who kind of, in a way, is being critical of Kimberly Crenshaw, because the traditional use of intersectionality is as an intersectionality of identities, right? So that leads us to identity politics, that I'm only caring about this because it's related to my identity, right? So does that mean that all those struggles in the world that are not related to your personal identity you should completely ignore? And so the intersectionality of struggles is connecting the struggles and working together collectively in solidarity, right? To work against those, and seeing that that doesn't mean we're all the same. We're very different, but that we share a strategy, we share a goal of reducing oppression in the world. And so that's what I've seen. And by the way, this is not just like intellectual point. This is what I've actually witnessed at those conferences. Like, what I really enjoy about the Islamophobia conference, people coming, first of all, it's interdisciplinary, so coming from different disciplines, from different parts of the world, and Muslims and non-Muslims, and different kinds of Muslims, right? And I remember the first time I attended that conference, I saw a lot of Jewish activists. I saw a lot of Christian activists. I saw a lot of atheist activists, right? So, and that's what drew me to this field. What's happening on the ground? What the work that we're doing, connecting activism with scholarly work, right? Now, the people that are reacting to the term obviously haven't witnessed that world, haven't engaged with that literature, so they're just reacting to the Islam part of the Islamophobia, which they hate because what else have they been exposed to? Except that it's associated with terrorism, and, you know, that it's backward and conservative and all those things. So that's all they know, right?
And you also use Islamophobia and Islamophilia in the book.
Yeah, so that's a good point, because the fantasy ultimately involves both points, and that's like the more subtle form of the racism is the Islamophilia, which is which looks on the surface like you love Muslims, but ultimately you're just using them for a specific purpose. So I use the example, I think from the election, when Bill Clinton was like, Muslims, we want you, we love you, but you need to work with us against terrorism, right? So just, you love them, but you're just framing them in relation to terrorism. So how is that different from the right-wing discourse? And that's supposedly the liberal. And so conceptually, I associate Islamophobia with conservatism and the reactionism, and I associate Islamophobia with liberalism, and which is basically what Tariq Ali calls the extreme center, right? And if you're a liberal in the U.S., and this is kind of honestly kind of idiotic, but as you know, in the U.S., liberals is conflated with like radical leftists, right? So you're a liberal, you're crazy,
socialist,
right? And liberal in the U.S. is really a centrist everywhere else in the world.
Mm-hmm.
They're not that radical. They're just like all about slow reform and so what I'm interested in is radicalism, right? Which is really what's missing. And this is very strategic. By conflating liberalism with radicalism, you actually don't allow for that negative space to exist.
Right.
And so what is the radical response to the Islamophobia, Islamophilia fantasy? Which is, the Islamophilia is saying, oh, I love Islam, I love Sufism, I love Rumi, right? It's like that kind of response, which you might expect from liberals in the U.S., right? And of course, if you say that to Muslims, they're gonna look at you like and raise their eyebrows, right? And so, what is the radical response? It's really to own your ignorance. I think that's the radical response, which is the Socratic one, right? I know that I don't know, and that's okay. There's no way I can know everything. I cannot be an expert on Islam. I'm not an Islamic studies scholar, but the problem with Islamophobia, Islamophilia is people act as if they're Islamic studies scholars. Oh, I know what this is about. I know what this religion is about, right? It's all about hate and it's all about that. Wow. So you're ignorant, but you don't even know that you're ignorant. So I think the radical response is to own our ignorance about anything, really. I mean, that's one example, but this could be in relation to any group of people that we don't know much about, right?
I actually try to do that a lot on this podcast because, like, a lot of times when I read somebody's work, there's something, like I said, I've never heard of Lacanian discourse analysis before, and I think it's great. And I just, like, try to say, like, I don't know what this is. Can you explain it to me or talk more about it? Because, I can't know everything, and people listening don't know everything, and that's okay. That's why we're listening and learning and talking.
Absolutely, all of us. And it's humility, ultimately, right? And so Lacan actually talked about it, which is learned ignorance. He talks about that, which goes all the way back to Socrates, which is a form of knowledge, the knowledge that you don't know. That's why it's called learned ignorance. Whereas ignorance without the learned part is the kind of ignorance that leads to hatefulness, right? And so it sounds weird, but I think that that's the actual radical response to the fantasy. But not many people are in that position. But if more people are in that position, then we're in a stronger position to completely reject the fantasy and probably change things. And that can happen over time.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I really wish the U.S. would have a multi-party system, because having the Democrats versus Republicans is just it's just back and forth, and it seems to just get worse and worse. And I don't know. I mean, at least as my whole adulthood, it's just the next one comes in and just has to work at undoing all the problems from the last person, and then the next one comes in and just destroys everything more.
True. Yeah, it's kind of a simplistic, binaristic system, right? And that's part of the issue, is how the complexity of the world is reduced. The complexity of the United States, a country of more than 300 million people, how can it be reduced to two parties?
To do teams. It's like teams.
Yeah.
You're on my team or you're not on my team,
Yeah, either you're with us or you're with the terrorists.
Exactly.
Right? And so, I would hope to at least see three parties, because, and obviously multi-party is the best, but ultimately I do believe that there are three political positions, which is, this goes back to the French Revolution, and it had to do with literally where everyone was sitting, and that's why we got the left, right, center term, the leftists were sitting on the left, and they were the radicals that wanted, um, you know, systemic change, right? Revolutionary change. And then you have the liberals in the middle who are centrists, and they want reformation. They want to reform the system, so slowly change it through the electoral system and what have you. And then you have the conservatives who like the way the things were before, and they want to keep it that way. So they have this fantasy about returning to the past, and that's why they're reactionary. In the US, we only really have liberals and conservatives, and Democrats are liberals, conservatives are what the Republican Party. We really don't have that third space, and so we talk about third parties, and they do exist, the Green Party, but they're extremely weak, and they have no significance on a federal level. Mm-hmm. Perhaps they could do something, and this is what we're seeing changing actually in the US. On a local level, these more radical parties like Democratic Socialists of America are actually can do something on a local level. They could win seats as city council members or even mayors. But when it comes to the federal level, the presidential elections, it does boil down to two positions. Mm. So the complexity is reduced like that. Yeah.
So what are you working on now?
Yeah, so I kind of wanted to mention a couple of things. So you were asking me about the Critical Psychology Certificate Program, I think, on Twitter.
Right.
So that's something I did with the Global Center for Advanced Studies, or GCAS, which is this online university, college, that has satellites all over the world, really. So they're currently based in Dublin, but they have satellites in the US, in Latin America, all over, really. So they're trying to use digital currencies and, trying to really challenge the hegemonic neoliberal system of education that we see in the US and other parts of the world. And so I was invited to, by Creston Davis, the chancellor and founder, to do this program, mainly because my friend and colleague Todd Sloan passed away, and he was one of the leading figures in critical psychology, and he was going to do it, and unfortunately he passed away. And so pretty much I took over after him. And what's interesting is that last year he was sharing with me what he was working on, and he wanted feedback on the program. And I didn't think that I was going to actually do it right after. So it happened. So I did that over the summer, July. We did 4 sessions, kind of looking at what is critical psychology, what are the theoretical resources, and then what are the practical applications of that. So that certificate program is online, and you can go to the website. The other thing I did was I organized this international conference, which was really exciting, and that was in September, the International Critical Psychology Praxis Congress. And we had scholars coming from all over the world, all over the United States, to Hispaniola, New Mexico. So I'm based in northern New Mexico. I teach at Northern New Mexico College, which is on historically Tewa land, and we're surrounded as a campus by 8 northern Pueblo tribes, right? So these are indigenous tribes, and so our students come from these tribes as well as other communities. And so the institution that I work for serves underserved students from northern New Mexico who are mostly Hispanic and Native American. So this is quite an amazing experience to work with my students, right? And so they actually helped me organize the conference I was telling you about. And they had a great time. They did a great job. And even though they're undergraduate students, they were able to engage with these scholars on their level. And so the scholars were very impressed with them. And that was very empowering and meaningful as an experience. Yeah.
I love
we
that.
live-streamed. Yeah, we live-streamed the event, and the videos from the conference are all on the Critical Psychology website, which is criticalpsychology.org. So anyone interested can check that out. All of them are there. And we had amazing keynote speakers, including Tommy Curry. I'm a big fan of his. And he just he published a book called The Man Knot, which came out last year, 2018, and received the American Book Award. So for me to get him, and he's a distinguished professor or chair at the University of Edinburgh. And so to get him from Edinburgh to Hispaniola to give a keynote speech and like hang out with him over 2 days, and it was great for the students, but also I really enjoyed that too. And we made it happen, and it was a really, really enjoyable experience.
That's great. And we'll put links to everything like in the text that accompanies the episode so that people can see all these things.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm working on a book of conference proceedings for that. So that's one project. I just released a critical introduction to psychology. Came out in October. It's an edited volume where I ask critical psychologists to basically respond. Have you ever taken... You probably took Intro to Psychology when you were undergraduate student. What did you think of that course?
I mean, I remember it being very general introductions to like all the different kinds of psychology, including like Freud, but also like behavioral and everything. But actually, my undergraduate psychology degree made me think that graduate school was going to be more eclectic. I thought that they were going to kind of teach us the range and like all the different modalities. Like this is psychoanalytic, this is behavioral, this is cognitive behavioral. It wasn't
like that, right?
And it was not like that at all. No.
Yeah, so having taught that course for several years, the students, my observation is that the students find it very frustrating because it's too eclectic, makes psychology seem like a discipline that doesn't make sense. It's all over the place, which I guess it is, right? I mean, you can see that clearly with the APA divisions, right? And so they're like always wondering in that course, like, what is psychology if it's all those things? Like one makes it one thing, right? So they're frustrated on that level. I'm frustrated with them on that level because not everything is equally interesting to me as I'm teaching. But the other big piece was, so I taught at University of West Georgia before Northern New Mexico College. And University of West Georgia is, the majority of the students are African American. So it's a different context, but also dealing with minority students, right? And so I'm looking at my African American students, I'm looking at my Hispanic students, my Native American students, and I'm teaching Intro to Psychology, and they're like, where do we see ourselves in this? Where are we? What is this? What are we learning this? How is this relevant to us? Where are the African American psychologists? Where are the Hispanic psychologists? Where are the Native American psychologists? They're not there, right? Of course, most of the psychologists tend to be male that we learn about in Intro to Psychology. They tend to be white, right? And they tend to be very conservative in their mainstream approach, right? And so I've been frustrated with this problem for a while, and I decided to contribute to a solution, which was to invite critical psychologists to respond to every single chapter that you find in a typical Intro to Psychology textbook, right?
That's great.
So learning, how do you want to respond to learning from a critical psychological perspective, or neuroscience, right? And so we did that, and it's really a nice volume, and I can send you a copy actually if you're interested.
I would love to read it.
Yeah, it's a fun one. And also I gave them this challenge of thinking of psychology globally, right? And so trying to include, and because this has to do with citational politics, this is Sarah Ahmed talks about this, our citational practices, who are we citing? Because it's not just about knowledge, there's a political aspect to it. What are the voices that we keep platforming or highlighting? And so I think it's an ethical, political imperative to really think about who are we citing, and can we go outside our comfort zone to cite people from the global south and cite psychologists from the global north who have been excluded, like Kenneth and Mamie Clark, like, when you look at their doll test studies, extremely important, and they were cited in Brown v. Board of Education, right? To end as one of the reasons for ending segregation is that segregation actually has this negative effect on students. So it actually is not conducive for a learning environment. And they were amazing couple psychologists, and that's never included in intro psychology textbooks. So I actually make a point when I teach that I make students read their work directly, primary sources, right? So things like that, that's the challenge, and I think we have that responsibility, especially if we're more critical as psychologists, to do that. Other than this, I have to maybe 3 more projects I can tell you about. So I translated a book called Fundamentalism and Secularization from Arabic to English. It's an Egyptian. It's written by an Egyptian philosopher called Murad Wahba, and it was published in 1995. And Murad Wahba is still with us. He's in his 90s, and I got his approval, and he gave me feedback on the translation. I finished everything. Currently, I'm corresponding with a big publisher to get it out there. So this is cool because here's a philosopher from the global south who I consider a world philosopher because he's engaging with literature from what we would consider European knowledge, right? European philosophy, but he's also coming from a different perspective, and so expanding and complexifying. So my position is always not to say, oh, we shouldn't cite Europeans and just only cite non-Europeans. That's not my point. My point is to cite Europeans and everyone else. We can think in a global way, right? And so I think it's important for people in the world, especially that don't read in Arabic, to read his work and to see a philosopher from North Africa writing about those issues way ahead. Like this is 1995. He's talking about fundamentalism and secularization way before 9/11, all of that. So it's related to that whole project, and he has a lot of interesting analyses about the kind of organic relationship between fundamentalism and capitalism, and how actually they sustain each other. There's a whole interesting history there. We can get into that, but that's a whole complex kind of territory. So that's one big project that hopefully will come out fairly soon. I have a sequel to Decolonial Psychoanalysis that I'm working on.
Nice.
Yeah, it's called Freud and Said.
Nice.
So, yeah, it's kind of a dialogue between Sigmund Freud and Edward Said. And the idea came from me as I was doing research for Decolonial Psychoanalysis. Edward Said was clearly influenced by psychoanalysis, was clearly interested in Sigmund Freud, but no one has really explicitly written any book about that connection. So I was like, it doesn't exist. I might as well write about that. So I'm looking specifically at 3 of Said's texts where he makes explicit references to psychoanalysis, and I'm seeing how those concepts have influenced him and his ideas, and really showing that, and of course trying to address also the question that I end this book with, Decolonial Psychoanalysis, which is the question of liberation praxis. I end the book with that question as an open question, because like once you have a new master, and then what, right? So I'm trying to think more about that question in that kind of sequel, to think more about that, where I ended Decolonial Psychoanalysis. So that's what I'm working on. Is kind of a daunting project, to be honest with you, because it's huge and I'm really overwhelmed, but it's necessary, and hopefully I should be able to finish it by summer of 2020. So
what I've learned with books is that I just have to like let myself take my time and like really think through and digest it, because as soon as it's done, then you start working on, or I start, you do clearly too, just start working on something else. So we might as well take our time a little bit, because it's not like that project ends and then we have a break,
I need to take a break too, because for the conference was so successful that they asked me to do it on a yearly basis, and I was like, no, I need a year off, and it could be every 2 years, but I have all these other things that I want to do, and I can only do them if I'm able to focus on one thing at a time. Now, lastly, because I know you're into the esoteric, and we have that connection, we didn't get a chance to really talk about it, but you and Carl obviously And that's something that I find fascinating about your work, the esoteric dimension. And that's something that I was way more into before everything else that I did. Um, so, which has to do with the question of how I got into psychoanalysis, actually, if you're interested to know.
Yes,
Uh,
please.
but it has to do with surrealism. And as you know, the surrealism has these deep connections with esotericism, right? So when I was an undergrad student at AUC, that's when I got into Freud and Jung. I was reading both of them at the time, and I was really into surrealism in terms of paintings as well as films, and I still am to this day. More films than paintings, though. So I was into Salvador Dali, René Magritte. In terms of surrealism, I was interested in David Lynch, Luis Buñuel, all these different surrealists. And what really got me interested in psychoanalysis, because I was an artist before I was a psychologist, and I'm still an artist, but like that's the chronological order. And you are also an artist, so we have these connections too. But what really got me into it was surrealism showed me is a way of it was a way of capturing or showing the unconscious in an aesthetic way, and I really loved that. And so I was interested in that question of representations of the unconscious, or different forms of the unconscious, and obviously surrealism explicitly tried to do that. And of course Lacan, great links, right? He was actually friends with Salvador Dali. I believe he was his physician as well.
Mm-hmm.
So we have these historical links, and that's something, by the way, I know you probably explored this, but not many Lacanians explore this connection, which is, I think, crucial for Lacan's thought. And in some way you can even look at his writing style and his aesthetic as surreal.
Mm-hmm.
Like he was tripping people with his seminars and his writings, and that's because of that influence early on. And he was writing in the Minotaur and like hanging out with the surrealists, and so like that's a fascinating time, obviously, and a lot of interesting stuff came out of that. And Lacan, I think, is one of them, but not many people think about that explicitly, but I think you do.
Yeah, for sure. And he's so
yeah.
creative. He's such a creative thinker.
Yeah.
And like that's why I get so frustrated. I mean, I love Lacanians, but like I get frustrated when people get too wrapped up in like disputing, like turning him into a dogma. Like, no, he means this,
Yeah.
and no, he means this. It's like,
Absolutely.
but he's so like evolving all the time, and I don't think that he wants us to do that. We're just supposed to like let these ideas be generative and in our own, and create our own ideas. Not just argue about what he meant.
And they get too serious, right? And there's like a playfulness in Lacan, right? There's the aesthetic dimension. There's like a humorous aspect to it. He's always playing with words. He's playing.
Exactly.
Right? And so why is he doing that? It has an aesthetic effect. It's not it's formal. It's purely formal, and that's what we're interested in. We're interested in form, right? We're going back to the unconscious being hidden in plain sight. We're interested in forms of the unconscious. So yeah, when they get too serious and they turn him into dogma, then yeah, it completely destroys the whole project. So I think we need to always remember the surreal foundations of Lacanian psychoanalysis, right? And of course, Freud himself was also interested in the aesthetic, maybe not surrealism, but we know about his collection of like relics and sculptures, and like he was definitely interested in that, especially ancient Egypt, which
I was gonna say that.
Yeah, I find that fascinating. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
And I can see some stuff behind you too.
Yeah. I was fortunate. Some of these things are from Colombia, and then I was in Morocco over the summer. And last year I actually got to go to Egypt.
Cool.
Last September. What an amazing place.
Where did you go?
I
Cairo?
went, yeah, and then I went into Upper Egypt as well. But I also went, you mentioned in your book that you're, and you mentioned the Coptic, and I got to stay in this Coptic monastery outside Cairo, Anaphora.
Yeah.
I loved Anaphora. What a special place.
Yeah. Did you get a chance to see Siwa?
No.
What about, did you go to Sinai?
No.
Yeah, so my favorite place in Egypt is Sinai.
Okay.
Especially Nueva, which is on the Red Sea. And this is like my favorite place in the world, to be on the beach, in a very simple beach, so like in a hut, because that's how it is there. You're living in a hut on the beach between the Red Sea, between a range of mountains, and just this going back to the simple life, enjoying just being, not using social media, phones. Like when I go there, I don't do that stuff, I haven't been back in actually a number of years, unfortunately, but like I've had some interesting esoteric experiences there too. Given like, supposedly Moses received the commandments in that part of the world. Like it's charged as a place, and you feel it.
You can feel it, yeah.
You feel it. So one of the weird experiences I had, I went to this place called the Color Canyon in Sinai, and when I was inside the canyon, you don't hear anything. No cars, no planes, no people. It really is the sound of silence, right? Like, and I was able to hear the mountains. And that was a really weird experience, but I loved it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of an esoteric experience. Like those mountains are really, they've been there for such a long time, and they're charged with, so much like energy, and you can hear that somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like a trippy experience being in there. So that links to maybe the final thing I want to tell you about, which is Alchemy in Hyde Park, my second feature film, which is an esoteric drama. That's how I describe it.
Ah.
Yeah. So and so before I did my PhD in psychology in Georgia, I was in Chicago doing an MFA in film. So that was my MFA thesis project, which I shot in. Have you been to Chicago?
Mm-hmm.
So you know Hyde Park?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I was living in Hyde Park, and I decided I was, I love the architecture in Chicago, like everyone should, right? And I wanted to make a feature film, completely shot and set in Hyde Park, right? And I wanted to use Hyde Park almost as a character in the film, right? So it's called Alchemy in Hyde Park because there are 4 characters in the film, and Hyde Park is the 5th character. And it's about the alchemy between these different characters. And the idea was not to have one protagonist, because that's typically any narrative structure has one protagonist that you follow, but to have 4. And you can, as an esoteric person, you can imagine the implications of having 4 and all of that. But it was very much drawing on the tarot, and also astrology to some extent. And so that's a whole other conversation. That's why I'm kind of telling you about this in the end, so it's unfair. But
well, we'll just have you on again. How do we see this film?
So it's on Vimeo, actually. So you can find it there, and there's a website for the alchemyinhydepark.com.
Okay.
So
we will link to all these things, and I'm going to watch them.
Yeah, I think you're gonna. And I saw you and Carl did some stuff with like Kenneth Anger and all that, and I like the fact that Lucifer Rising is shot in Egypt too.
Mm-hmm.
Like that to me, because of that connection too, is really cool.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Yeah.
So should we start there? Is there anything else? Are you going to be at the APA Division 39 that Lara's doing? Oh,
yes,
good. So we'll meet.
Yes, we will. Is Carl gonna be there too?
Yeah, he'll come to New York with me. I don't know that he'll come to the conference. He's actually doing a book of interviews with Genesis Peerage, and I think they're going to have a release party because it was going to be released on Jen's 70th birthday, which is February 22nd, and Jen lives in New York. So I think they're going to plan like a release party the same weekend as the conference, since we're going to be in New York anyway. But that'll be in the evening, so maybe we can all go to that after.
Yeah, let's do that. And I'm gonna be with my partner too, so it will be cool. Okay. I also told Alfonso if he could come, it would be great for all of us.
That would be so fun.
Yeah. So that should be a cool conference. And Mireille Fanon's gonna be there.
I'm so excited. That's cool. Why I had to go. We had originally like other plans that time of the month, and I was like, could we please move them, because I really want to go to this.
I'm glad you're going. So we get to all.
Are you presenting your book?
I'm presenting on something related to Freud and Said book.
Okay,
So
cool.
I'll talk about Egypt really, and because and what's going on right now politically, and and because it's the counter-revolution pretty much won in Egypt, right? So thinking about that and thinking about, because that's not a sustainable position actually. So thinking about what could come out of that, because the revolution happened. We can't pretend that it didn't happen. It didn't win, but it happened. And so that means that long term something will change that's systemic, because there's that demand of the revolution which was real, So, and my partner Connie, she's presenting on Chile, because Chile now she's Chilean, and she's looking at repression in Chile in both senses of the term, political repression, but also unconscious repression. And the people in Chile are revolting against the neoliberal regime of Piñera. And so we're seeing all these mass movements happening all over the world. Most of us are unhappy with how the world is going, right? And especially with the rise of fascism all over the world, right?
It's time for a change.
It's time for a major radical change.
Overhaul the systems.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to Rendering Unconscious. You've just heard a discussion with Dr. Robert BESHARA. For more, please visit his website, robertbeshara.com. That's www.robertbeshara.com. You can also visit my website, drvanessasinclair.net. That's drvanessasinclair.net, or renderingunconscious.org. Rendering Unconscious is also a book. Rendering Unconscious, Psychoanalytic Perspectives, Politics, and Poetry. Available from Trapart Books, 2019. Please visit our publisher's website, www.trapart.net. You can support the podcast by visiting our Patreon, patreon.com/VANESSA23CARL. Your support is greatly appreciated. Links to everything can be found in the text accompanying this episode.
I'm police. I do what I want. Anything I want. You don't worry, Alice. I not hurt you.
What is your name?
Alice.
My friends call me Nico. I have many friends here.
You see many things. No happy things. I'm sorry